So which?
There's one in here.
Test, test, test.
There we go. That's okay. I'll put some tape to hold it down.
Mm. Is it fresh for the day?
Yeah. Are you okay?
Mm-hmm. Sitting still.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Everything okay?
Yes.
Oh, you're just taping that.
Yeah. I forgot to put these out.
Sorry?
These out.
Oh, okay.
Hey.
You're not grossed out by hungry.
No, it looks great.
It's not bad. It's not bad. Where did Burnett go? Where's Burnett?
Test, test, test.
Oh, for that. I booked the
Oh, okay.
dinner.
I'm so excited about that.
Oh,
Perfect. It's perfect.
You can kind of wander around, but.
Perfect one too, right? Like,
Yeah, you want to see the menu?
is it just us? Are there other? Were there a few other people last time? I can't remember.
Um,
I think there were a couple others. I got the.
no, it was just us last time.
I've got the thing on there.
yeah.
So you had a good morning, I hear.
Little.
So, I mean, they must be wondering even why the part came off. Like, how the heck did that happen? It's a weird thing.
So they have pictures of the car in the shop all the way up to when it leaves and it's there, so. disappeared sometime.
Near old office. Where the bus stop is. Went to one downtown, just to get us downtown.
I just don't understand how that part is.
So we went to
Like something would hit it.
So it's still.
I've seen parts of
Rip it off.
town.
This is the,
But I just.
Presentations like that.
It was an insurance anyway. It was one of them. Went to see. And this is my cousin. Who did you go see? This is friend. Fred's friend, Fred. Yeah. Holly.
You just need to get it.
So are we gonna put this here for him to speak into? Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, your box. This is
Oh,
your,
this is the box.
this is
You can't go
yours.
inside of the box.
because there's a camera there for our people who are
Ah,
watching from remote offices and stuff like that.
where all the hundreds of people are.
Yeah.
Where's Eleanor?
Eleanor decided to take the elevator. Well, on Sunday, somebody got locked in on her.
So Bernie, do you want to wait for a few more of your people to come in and
This is them.
okay,
Yeah, now we're good to go. If they get seated.
sure.
See a lot?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out to our Lunch and Learn. Is that what they call it now? Lunch and Learn, yeah. Our guest today is Burnett, who has traveled widely with various roles with the KWYMCA and also as a teacher with Rockway. And for the last 6 years, he's led a learning tour to Guatemala. And as of last year, that learning tour is officially through MCC Guatemala and MCC Ontario. Previously, it had been through Rockaway. So Bernie and some of his group members are going to tell us about their trip to Guatemala last year, and also tell us a little bit about, there will be another learning tour this year to Guatemala as well. So I'll let Bernie take it away. Thanks, Bernie.
Thanks, Ken. So I'm going to assume, maybe it's a bad assumption, that you guys all know what MCC is about. But just in case you don't, here are some strategic directions of MCC. Prioritizing work with uprooted and vulnerable people, emphasizing building healthy, sustainable communities, promoting justice and peace, investing in young people, home and abroad, and working through mutually transformative relationships to nurture and align the passions of the church partners and supporters. As Ken mentioned, I started this trip with Rockaway with students, and then when I retired from Rockaway, they moved on to another trip, and so I was still in contact with MCC Guatemala and asked if I could bring a different set of clientele, older, 18 and up, and they said, yeah, that'd be fantastic. And so through MCC Ontario and MCC Guatemala, we continued with these learning tours. So these people with me today are sort of the first group that went. There was 9 of us in total. So Eleanor and Zenas, if you want to turn around and wave, and Joan Crick, and my wife, Marg, were part of the trip along with a couple others. These learning tours, MCC does learning tours through a lot of countries. Sorry? MCC does learning tours through a lot of countries, including Guatemala. It's a great way to learn about a country and what MCC is doing there. And in this specific tour, we wanted to learn about, obviously, the country of Guatemala. And so we did a lot of reading on the history of Guatemala. We wanted to walk with the Mayan communities, the Mayans being the indigenous people in Guatemala, learn about their history, hear their stories. They've just, I guess you could call it a recent civil war in the late 80s and 90s. They had a civil war that was quite brutal. One of the interesting things is the parallels between the history of Guatemala, who the Spaniards landed there in 1500, as compared to North American history, where the Europeans, the French, the English, and the Spanish landed around that same time and had pretty much the same impact on the indigenous communities that happened in Guatemala. So it's sort of a parallel history. Wanted to learn how MCC is working with the Mayan people and transform our perspective. Learn about what it is that we do here that impacts life in Guatemala. You may not think that that happens, but after the tour, you find out that a lot of what we do here impacts what happens there. Plant the seeds for ongoing connections, and then learn some practical ways that we could support the community. So ways that we could advocate for that community back home, ways we can financially support them, and other ways to support them in ways that we need. MCC does a lot of work with the indigenous community. So the indigenous community are the ones that identify the needs and identify the solutions, and MCC is just there to support that. This is the MCC office in Guatemala. So we do, during our introduction, we learn about MCC here in Canada and Ontario, and over there we learn about MCC Guatemala. Samia is the place where we stay. Initially, to begin with, this is an MCC guest house that houses people that are about to go out on volunteer opportunities. One of the first things we start off with is what we call a contrast tour. So the country of Guatemala is a beautiful country geographically. It has some very beautiful spots, but there is a very large dichotomy between the rich and the poor. The Mayans tend to be on the poor end, and then what I would call Métis here, or crossbreeds, are called the Latinos. And the majority of the Latinos are in the poverty area, and but some are rich, and then the Spaniards generally are the rich folks. The biggest contrast, we go to a cemetery, and out the back of the cemetery is a dump. And in this photo, you can see people that actually live and work in the dump, getting things for recycling. And then the cemetery itself, you have the burial plots for the poor. So they have to rent these spots. If they can't afford rent, then they can't even find a spot in the cemetery. And if the rent runs out, then they're just dumped into the dump out the back. This is also in the cemetery are the mausoleums of the rich. And this is a good contrasting picture. You have the rental units in the back, and then you have a mausoleum. This one is of the family that owns the water and soft drink rights in Guatemala City. While we were there, there was a memorial to girls that had been killed. You may have heard it in the news, where they were in an institution and they were locked in the rooms and a fire started and no one bothered to unlock the doors, and quite a few of them perished. One of what I think is one of the neatest projects that MCC has been involved with is in a place called La Vega. And here a bunch of us are hiking over a mountain from one town to the other. Generally Guatemalans, that's how they get around, by walking. This village actually has a road that you can go around, and some of our people took the road via a really smooth truck ride. And but this epitomizes the situation in Guatemala. They're an agriculture community. Hydroelectric projects from Italy and gold mines from Canada have come in and tried to take over the land. And the youth have started to try and migrate to the United States to make money. That's a whole story in itself. The perils of trying to get across to Mexico and then across the Mexican border and into the States and then getting employment. So in this village, as in other villages that MCC is working with, they are trying to find ways to generate income so they don't have to sell out to these companies. These Canadian mining companies, they're sneaky, they're ruthless. If you go on their site, you think they're the most friendly environmental people ever, but they basically rape the countryside, they throw cyanide into the air. They accidentally have their ponds where the cyanide is supposed to settle, leak out the back, and create a lot of problems for the villages downriver, and so on and so forth. So in this village, they're doing a couple things. That lodge you see there, which is where we stayed, is an eco lodge, and it's set up for tourists coming through. The one in the front's the start of a second one that's incomplete at the moment. But they're generating income. Several families run this, and this is where we stayed, and they provide food and accommodation for hikers in the area. There's a volcano, Tacana, nearby, and so they generate income in that way. I keep going back. So this is a room on top of that lodge. And then the other one they're doing is organic farming. This is one is dedicated to herbs, and this is back in the Eco Lodge. And they also have regular organic farming for fruits and for vegetables and that sort of thing. The other initiative, the tall yucca plant. If you see these ponds here, they house trout. And they've actually begun to make their own fingerlings and produce their own fingerlings and raise them up into adults. And then that provides food for the village, for the people that are raising them and for people in the village, and also they ship it off to market. So it's another income. The interesting thing is that fish is not a normal part of the Guatemalan diet, so it's been introduced to them that way as well. I call it the Garden of Eden. I think it's one of the most beautiful spots in the world. And here's an example of the organic farm, and they use, I don't know if you can see it there, but they use plastic bottles for framing the garden, for potting some of their plants. You want to talk to some of this? Let's see, is this your part?
One of the goals of the trip was to learn about the Mayan culture and some examples of the Mayan clothing. It's a very colorful clothing, and each region in Guatemala would have different color emphasis. So this, what you see in this particular person may not be the same as some of the colors that are in some of the fabrics that we have over here. How'd you go forward? Some examples again of more of the Mayan culture, some markets. Two women on the side were two sisters. It was fun because my sister and I also traveled together on the trip, so we got some sister pictures. One of the areas we went to was Lake Atitlan, and this whole lake is surrounded by beautiful volcanoes. And it's also the location of, this is our group, the location of another project that MCC has been involved in. This is called Onadesa. MCC was originally involved in this area in 2005 because of the result of a hurricane Stan. And this part of this particular volcano hillside washed away and wiped out a large section of the village there, impacting a lot of people, including the Mayan population in that area. So they worked there in disaster relief originally, and then working with the Mayan people, they realized that there was other things that met the MCC mandate, and so they formed a cooperative called Onadesa, where they're working with the Mayan people to meet several goals. This was a slide that's on the Onadesa website, and I thought it was really helpful because it identified why MCC got involved in this area. So it's 25% of the population is illiterate in Guatemala, but 60% of the indigenous population is illiterate. Only 1 in 4 indigenous girls stay in school after age 16. 4 out of 10 children who start primary school will finish, and that's up to grade 6. 51% of the population lives in poverty in Guatemala, but 79%, and that's less than $2 a day of the indigenous population live in poverty. And it's 4th in the world in poor nutrition. And one of the things that worked about the project in La Vega, when they were encouraging people to learn about organic gardening, that was also improving the health of the families, because it helped them understand the value of good nutrition and how you can grow vegetables to improve the nutrition. And then another thing was lack of clean water. So Onadesa works primarily with women, actually, because the indigenous women have had not as great an influence in their home life. And so it's teaching the indigenous women on how they can increase the nutrition in their family, how they can earn a living, how they can be responsible members of the community. So the girl in this one girl in the middle is an MCC worker from the States who was there for a year working specifically with Onadesa. And some of these women, this woman here was our host with Zenas and Eleanor. We were able to have a homestay with her. And that's one of the projects that Onodessa is teaching the women how they can actually host families and guests in their homes to earn an income. It also encourages them to have clean, safe water because they have to have safe water for their guests. So this Kat is staying with this family when she's living and working with Onodessa, but this woman would also host homestays. The other focus for Onodessa is education for the youth, running after-school programs and tutoring programs for the Mayan community. One of the challenges they have is the school is taught in Spanish, and the families do not speak Spanish, so they have very little opportunity to help their children in school if they can't understand the material that they're learning in school. And there's also a lot of pressure on the children to be supporting the family income when they're poor. So this is encouraging the students to stay in school, providing additional opportunities for them to learn and be successful in school. They support them some financially a little bit to help provide them with their school supplies. This is when Bernie first started going to Onodessa, it actually was operating out of a little house, a little hut essentially. And you'll see the background here of a series of buildings that Onodessa has now grown to. It's a fantastic facility. And in front here is a peace park that Onodessa was instrumental in creating. There was a clash where the Mayans were trying to request a peaceful discussion and meeting with the military. And as they got to this point, the military started firing. And our open-air kitchen, they taught us how to make tortillas. This is me trying, and this is my disastrous tortilla experience over here, and the perfect tortillas on the other side. This area is called Chukmuk, and when the landslide wiped out the one section of the community, the government did rebuild some houses there, but the government determined that that area was still at risk and didn't want the people living there, so they built this community which is several miles away from where they had been living, away from their fields and their source of income. It reminded me a lot of what's happened in North America. We decided that the indigenous people should live there regardless of whether that's an appropriate location for them. And so this is the Chukmuk community that we stayed in. We did a presentation on Sunday, and someone asked us about how we were remaining connected to the people that we met here. We've had other projects that we've been connected in around the world, and it's amazing how people can connect with email and everything. This particular family and this location does not have any internet, so we don't have any opportunity to communicate them that way, so we have to be more creative in how we connect with them. While we're there, we also got some history about Onodessa and learned a lot about cultural activities. One of the things that Onodessa is doing is helping develop skills in the women for projects and items that they can sell. One of them is beading. They gave us an example of a beading workshop. We struggled to make these very thin beading bracelets, and they make this type of thing. I'll lay it out for you. Beautiful bracelets that they make, and the women can then sell in the marketplace and earn an income. They're very patient with it. So here's the type of thing, we were making these very simple bands, and women sitting in their yards at home will make these beautiful bead creations. We also had some cultural information, and Bernie reminded me that this woman was speaking in a shul, and this fellow was translating into Spanish, and then with someone else translating from Spanish to English for us. So it was an interesting experience. And here we were learning about corn. Corn tortillas are a staple of the Guatemalan diet, and there's all these different kinds of corn we were learning about, and also learning how corn was ground by hand.
That's a picture of an expert. The one on the right or left?
We also learned again about the Mayan culture, and this is our Guatemalan host, Sarah, who visited a coffee plantation. These are Arabica plants that originated in Ethiopia, which is interesting because I have traveled to Ethiopia, but I never got a chance to visit a coffee plantation there. So we had a great tour about this particular plantation, and this is a cooperative plantation that has its organic status. And they told us about why it was really important for the particular cooperative to emphasize the organics, because as you saw, this beautiful lake that is surrounding that area, all of the rain, etc., if you're using chemicals, etc., for your plants, that's running down into the lake. And they've been told the Lake Atitlan has something between 5 and 8 years to make substantial recovery before it's to the point that it's not recoverable. This particular cooperative felt that that was really important for them to be organic and take a stand against chemicals and try to maintain the land so they can actually have this land for many generations for growing coffee. They also had very strong, what I would have interpreted as fair trade policies in their cooperative. No child labor, their children have to be in school, sharing of resources, making sure that the money went right back to the people in the cooperative. So in my mind, those were very fair trade policies. So I said, well, why don't you also have your fair trade designation? And they said that in order for them to get their fair trade designation, it costs money. And they felt that that expense would take away valuable income from the cooperative that they really wanted to put back into the people that are working in the cooperative. And that was they valued the organic and the money going back to the people in the cooperative more than they did their free trade status. Does that sound right to you guys? Coffee was fantastic. It's an example of people, all of the materials and fertilizers that they use in that organic fertilizer are all hauled up the hill by hand. It's all manual labor. I also learned how many, that's almost that whole, well, more than that handful of coffee, just beans just for one single cup of coffee. I'm also really excited about fabrics, and there was beautiful, beautiful fabrics in Guatemala. You'll see this is looms to weave these beautiful fabrics that make up the skirts for the bulk of the indigenous and Mayan communities. Beautiful fabrics. Also lots of hand-dyed yarn that are made into beautiful scarves. These are lots of cooperatives. I was really impressed with the cooperatives that were formed to make sure that the money went right back to the families, and specifically the women making these garments. And for anyone interested, they were using a lot of the hand, or so what do you call those, Joan? I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden. It's a loom that you basically you're holding in your lap, and it's tied up the end. Backstrap, yes, yep. Lots of their hand spinning the yarn there for under Joan's observation. Yeah, I know you can tell a little bit more.
Thanks, Mark. We couldn't find Joan, we just went to the textile places and we could find her again. Oh. What happened there? Right. One of the stops we made was at a Mayan ruin, and again there we learned the history of the Mayans and their persecution, and all about their history. I won't go into detail. You'll have to come on a trip if you want detail on that. And this was a ritual at the back end of that we got to witness. And we did take some time to do some exploring of the country. So this is us heading up a volcano. It's called Bacaya. When I was there with the Rockway students one year, we actually saw lava flows And then the next year we couldn't go up because it had erupted. And this year it was actually active and making gurgling noises, but we got down in time. The thing is, you land at the bottom of the volcano and these people show up with horses asking if you want to pay for a ride. And of course, all my students said no, but some of us took horses right away. I explained to them that these people will follow you up with the horses until you stop, and then you will get a horse. And it gets more expensive as you get up. So up there, we roasted some marshmallows. There's obviously some hot spots, and you can see the activity off in the distance. And so I don't have the audio to that, but it was quite impressive. Various modes of transportation that we use, tuk-tuks, and which is that little middle vehicle there. Often we're in the back of pickup trucks crammed with people, so you just stop a truck and jump in the back. The record for a truck that I'd been in, it was a smaller truck than that, a Toyota, was 38 people. Horseback. As we mentioned, a lot of people are in poverty. They can't afford vehicles. But there you have a dichotomy right there between really fancy vehicles and trucks and the horse. But a lot of people will carry their firewood by just in bundles strapped to their head. And I remember once I saw a woman that looked very old, and I asked the guy how old she is, and it's 93. She's still carrying her firewood around. Okay. So I mean, that's a very quick snapshot of what we did on our tour. There is another one coming up February 27th to March 12th. The information's on the MCC website. And right now we're open to any questions you might have that you can ask of the participants. My question is whether they felt the goals of the trip were achieved, but
And the answer to that from me is definitely yes.
definitely yes. Okay, that's good to hear. Any questions?
You'd mentioned how we might be surprised in ways that our life here is connected and affects the lives of Mayans, a very rural, community that we do not intentionally interact with on a daily basis. Can you give some sort of examples of how our decisions are things that happen here affect those folks there?
If you buy anything with gold in it, or if you're invested in gold, you are supporting the Canadian mining companies. And as I briefly mentioned, their track record over there, a couple things. One is, I can't go out of the box. One is that, well, if you go to their website, as I mentioned, their environmental record looks very impeccable. When you go and visit the actual mines, we didn't on this trip, but we had on others, and we talked about it on this trip. They would go in and say, we would like to buy your property because we're going to start an orchid farm. And they buy up the properties, and they pay bottom dollar for the properties. And then they come in and they just scrape off they actually remove mountains and tunnel in all directions and weaken the landscape around so that the villages that are existing outside of their area are actually start to crumble. And then to make gold, you have to run it through cyanide and water. They consume, I forget what the number was, but it was astronomical, the amount of water that they use. And it's, of course, they're using the local water. They run it through the gold with the cyanide and then put it in ponds out the back. And to get rid of the cyanide, they spray it into the air. So you have the cyanide in the air. And then lo and behold, these ponds start to empty out the back accidentally and go into the local rivers. And so you have birth defects, all kinds of cancers and so on down the river. They've lost their fish populations, and so the villages are devastated. So that's what you're supporting. Might be an example. The other thing is they work with the Guatemalan government, and a lot of internationally usually a government will get 20% of their take. In Guatemala, it's 2%. So the other impact is that they will hire locals, which you think is a good thing, but they're hiring the youth and they're paying them not a lot of money, but in Guatemala standards, it's a lot of money. And so those youth are pro-gold mine, and then their parents who are trying to live in the agricultural sense and seeing things destroyed around them, plus they've lost their labor, are in trouble, and they're anti-gold mine. And so now you have the community split and all kinds of issues that are going on. Be one example.
If you have any other questions, I'm just mindful of the time, but obviously if you have any other questions, feel free to ask Bernie and the members who went. Thank you, Bernie.
You're welcome.
For coming.
Thank you. Yeah, we're around. We'll stick around if you have any other questions.